The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, David Daley on why time is running out to stop Republican gerrymandering. Nicol Turner Lee on what it will take to deliver digital equity in a post-pandemic world. Plus, Bill Press with Carol Leonnig and Phil Rucker on their new book, I Alone Can Fix It, Donald J. Trump's Catastrophic Final Year. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The once-a-decade process of redistricting has begun, and the stakes could hardly be higher. David Daley is one of the nation's leading authorities on partisan gerrymandering, and he says if Democrats don't do more to stop it, Republicans will have the power to shape elections for years to come. And we say hello to David Daley, author of Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, and Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. He is a senior fellow at Fair Vote. David Daley, thanks for joining us today, and welcome back to the America's Democrats podcast.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Always a pleasure to have you with us. Now, as we get closer to the 2022 election, you've been drawing our attention to the role gerrymandering could have. Remind us how gerrymandering happens and what is the timeline we're looking at right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are really right in the very heart of this moment. Redistricting happens every 10 years. It follows the census. The census was completed last year. Census data is coming to states by mid-August. And then this process of drawing the maps that will define our politics for the next decade at the state legislative and the congressional level will really get underway in earnest. We have seen over the course of the last 10 years just how toxic an impact partisan gerrymandering can have on our politics, on our policy, and on our ability to respond even to a pandemic. And so this is a moment in which we need to be really aware of what is happening in state legislatures around the country and really pushing our lawmakers to act on partisan gerrymandering and do what they can to put an end to it before the next decade of our politics gets frozen into place and it's too late.
Yeah, well, it's certainly long overdue. Now, you recently wrote at The Guardian that Republicans can win the next election through gerrymandering alone, even if voters vote the same way as in 2020. How could this happen and where?
Yeah, it is really, I think, a sign of just how long-lasting these maps have been and the challenges that Democrats face around the country. Look, Democratic candidates for the U.S. House in 2020 won 4.7 million more votes than Republican candidates nationwide. That is the largest margin in a long time. But Democrats only have a 5-seat advantage. So you win by 4.7 million votes, and that only leads you to about 222, 223 seats. When Republicans back in 2014 had their best year at the House level in some time, they won by a margin of about 4.4 million votes, and that got them 247 seats. So that's a pretty big difference, and you can see the impact of gerrymandering and also political geography in that difference. So Republicans are going to have the complete power in 2020 to redraw lines in Texas, North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia for potentially as many as 2 or as many as 3 seats in some of those states. And then they're also going to have the ability to redraw lines in New Hampshire, Kansas, Missouri, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And in some of those states, Republican lawmakers have already made clear that they intend to either gerrymander the last remaining Democrat out, as they have said in Kansas or in New Hampshire, where they've made it really clear that they intend to claim at least one of the 2 U.S. House seats in that state. And then you've got folks like Congressman Cooper in Tennessee, or Congressman Yarmouth in Louisville, Kentucky, where you have blue city Democrats in deep red states. And it would be really easy for Republicans who have complete control of the process there to simply crack those cities in half, draw a line through them, attach half of those Democrats to one rural Republican district and the other half to another, make it almost impossible for a Democrat to actually win those seats. So I would say you're looking at somewhere between 12 and 14 seats that Republicans could claim through redistricting alone, so that you could have the same outcome, the exact same vote distribution. But because the lines move in some of those all-important states, it affects outcomes.
Absolutely. Now, you've also been writing about the undemocratic influence of gerrymandering for quite some time now. How is it that we're still having this discussion?
Boy, oh boy. Are you telling me that I'm boring? Because, yeah, no, I understand. We've been having this conversation for a long time. Listen, when minority rule gets entrenched within our politics, it's really hard to do anything about it, right? Because the legislative process has to be engaged to do anything about it. And Republicans who have gerrymandered themselves into power in North Carolina and Texas and Georgia and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, they aren't looking to do anything about it. They're looking to, pass laws right now that make it, that restrict voting rights even further in those states. Now, Democrats do have complete control of Congress and the White House. They have a trifecta in Washington, D.C. And we have this moment right now, a moment that might not happen again for, a long time, given the structural advantages that Republicans have in the Electoral College with the small state bias of the U.S. Senate, and that gerrymandering will give them in the U.S. House over the course of the next decade. So Democrats have got to be right now thinking about how they pass the For the People Act, how they put an end to partisan gerrymandering, how they protect voting rights and restore the protections of the Voting Rights Act that this U.S. Supreme Court has just been so brutally eviscerating over the course of the last decade, whether in the Shelby County case that attacked Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, whether in the gerrymandering cases like Abbott v. Texas and Common Cause versus Rucho that effectively closed the doors of the federal courthouses to partisan gerrymandering claims, and also made it much more difficult to show racial intent on a racial gerrymander. And then the case that we had back in June, Brnovich versus DNC, which effectively gutted key provisions of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. If Democrats in Washington cannot find it within themselves to make a carve out to the filibuster for voting rights in the middle of what really ought to be seen as a 5-alarm fire for representative democracy, we are in for a really difficult decade.
Well, how about the Electoral College? How is this going to affect the Electoral College?
I think what we could see here, and the system held ever so narrowly in 2020, right? And I think what we forget sometimes, because Joe Biden won what was one of the larger popular vote mandates of the last 35 or 40 years. He won the national popular vote by about 7.5 million. And yet he only won the Electoral College by taking about 44,000 votes in 3 states, Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. If those 44,000 votes in those close states go another way, you're looking at a 269 electoral college tie. And as we know, if the electoral college is tied, you go to a state delegation by state delegation vote, and Republicans have more delegations. So you would have likely seen Donald Trump reelected with an even larger popular vote deficit than he had in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. We have already seen what gerrymandered legislatures in Georgia and Wisconsin and what an extreme Republican legislature in Arizona are working on right now when it comes to voting rights. They are trying to suppress and build barriers before just enough voters in those three close states in order to make it extraordinarily difficult for Democrats to win another close race there in 2024. In Georgia, they are changing the rules on who controls and who certifies elections. They are trying to put, for example, the Fulton County Election Board, which contains the city of Atlanta, under control of the state legislature. And if what we see in 2024 are more fraudits like we've seen in Arizona, are more attempts to make it more difficult for Democrats to win statewide electors and to have those electors certified by Republican legislatures. I mean, if say Democrats win in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and Georgia and Arizona, will gerrymandered state legislatures in those states certify the results and send the proper electors to Washington? And these are the questions that I think ought to be keeping a lot of us up at night, and that really threaten the foundations of our system.
And in terms of turning this around, what's your response to how Democrats have responded to gerrymandering?
I think that Democrats really fell asleep on this back in 2010. After the big victories of 2008, I think Democrats in many ways thought that they had an inevitable coalition of rising and changing demographics, and that they'd be in charge for a long time. And Republicans ran a really effective play in 2010 to kind of take back state legislatures and redraw maps in 2011. And we've seen that it's been really difficult for Democrats to win on those maps ever since. And so while I do think that there is a lot of blame to be had for the failures back in 2010, what we're seeing is that it's really difficult to defeat a gerrymander. It's really difficult to out-organize a gerrymander. And so when I hear Democrats now saying that, well, we're just going to put more money into get out the vote efforts, or we're just going to attempt to register more voters, that is not a play that has worked in North Carolina or Wisconsin or Texas or Pennsylvania or Michigan against these gerrymandered maps all decade. You cannot out-organize and out-register voter suppression and extreme partisan gerrymandering. A lot of Democrats understand this, and I think that you are seeing movement on the For the People Act, but there's a couple of Democratic senators who are blocking this and are standing in the way of the kind of filibuster reform that is going to be necessary to really protect and defend democracy.
Well, and I know you are a strong advocate of the For the People Act. Do you see a path for it to pass?
I think the only path for it to pass will be if Senators Manchin and Sinema are willing to change their minds on the filibuster. And I think all they have to do is look at what's happening in state capitals around the country and understand that we are under assault right now, and that this is an assault that is determined to create an entrenched and enduring Republican minority rule that will be really difficult to defeat at the ballot box. We have a moment right now in which we can try to do something about it, and we absolutely have to. I mean, Senators Manchin and Sinema keep talking about how any changes to election laws and reforms have to be bipartisan. What do they think is happening in state legislatures around the country? Are these changes in Georgia and Arizona and Wisconsin and North Carolina and Florida and Texas, are they bipartisan? They are not bipartisan. This is a deeply partisan assault on the nature of representative democracy. And it is going to take Democrats to stand up and choose democracy over the filibuster, or else, I fear we will all have these sleepless nights in the future.
Well, short of passing the For the People Act, what can Democrats do, or what can voters do?
We have got to be really loud in this moment. Reverend Jesse Jackson and Reverend Barber in North Carolina have been leading these rallies and getting arrested. When you look at Jesse Jackson this summer, 79 years old with Parkinson's disease, in the August heat, 50 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, still putting his body on the line for voting rights and to defend democracy. I think that there's two ways of looking at this, right? I mean, one is we ought to be filled with sadness and rage that, 50 years after Selma, we are still having this exact debate in this country. But I think that there's a lot of inspiration that we can take in this moment from people who have been having this fight all of their lives, who understand that the push and pull, the arc of moral justice in this country has never just gone in one direction, that the arc of moral justice only bends when we all get our hands on it and pull it in the right direction, and that we all have that responsibility to it doesn't mean we all have to get arrested, but it means we ought to be taking part in these rallies. We ought to be calling our members of Congress. We ought to be making it clear in state legislatures around the country, if you live in North Carolina or Wisconsin or Georgia or Arizona, that you are watching as these maps are being drawn, that it will not be okay that politicians who try to take these maps and lines into back rooms and bunkers and private map rooms and law firms like they want to do, they will not get away with it. They will be shamed, and we are watching, and we are fighting back.
All right. David Daley, author of Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, and Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. David, as always, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to do it again soon.
A pleasure. Thank you.
And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why closing the digital divide is fundamental to pandemic recovery. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
If you're a corporate employee, you know that something unpleasant is afoot when top executives are suddenly issuing statements about how committed they are to their employees, making sure that all of them are treated with dignity and respect. For example, the PR chief of a global outfit named Teleperformance, one of the world's largest call centers, was recently going on and on about how, quote, we value our people and their well-being, safety, and happiness. Why did the corporation feel such a desperate need to proclaim its virtue? Because it's been caught in a nasty scheme to spy on its own workers. Teleperformance, a $6.7 billion global behemoth that handles customer service calls for Amazon, Apple, Uber, etc., saves money on overhead by making most of its 380,000 employees around the world work from their own homes. That can be a convenience for many workers, but a new corporate policy first imposed in March on thousands of its workers in Colombia is an Orwellian nightmare. Teleperformance is pressuring them to sign an 8-page addendum to their employee contracts, allowing corporate-controlled video cameras, electronic audio devices, and data collection tools to be put in their homes to monitor their actions. I work in my bedroom, one employee noted. I don't want to have a camera in my bedroom. Neither would I, and I doubt that Teleperformance's $20 million a year CEO would allow one in his mansion. Uglier yet, the privacy-obliterating contract requires that even the children of employees can be spied on at home. Nonetheless, the Colombian worker signed because her supervisor said she could lose her job if she refused. Of course, Teleperformance Inc. assures us that the data it collects on children is not shared elsewhere. But how do we know that? Trust us, they say. This is Jim Hightower saying, do you? Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The pandemic didn't create the digital divide, but it certainly has revealed the depth and severity of its impact. Nicol Turner Lee has studied the digital divide for more than 2 decades. She says any plan to build back better must ensure digital equity for all. And we say hello to Dr. Nicol Turner Lee, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies, the Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institute, and serves as Co-Editor-in-Chief of Tech Tank. Dr. Turner Lee has a forthcoming book on the U.S. digital divide titled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. Dr. Nicol Turner Lee, thank you for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's certainly our pleasure to have you with us. Now, we often hear talk of the digital divide without fully understanding its full meaning. In terms of access, what does the digital divide mean to you?
Well, that's such a great question. And, I have a book coming out later this fall, which is around the digital divide. And I think traditionally we've heard the digital divide be defined by a binary context, right? It's traditionally been who's online, who's not, who has a device, who doesn't. And today, and particularly that's after the pandemic, we're actually seeing a digital divide that's much more multifaceted, right? It's not just about who has access, who doesn't, but it's also about whether or not you have a credit card to take advantage of ride-sharing services, or if you have a smartphone to sign up to get a vaccination. We're seeing the digital divide become much more expansive. And I think that's for somebody like myself who's been doing this for decades, it's so interesting to see that it's actually moved up to the top of the list or the top 5 versus the top 20 that it used to be in. Because we're now seeing that it's not just about technology access, but it's really about the functions that ride off of broadband networks.
And can you describe some of the disparities that you've been observing in terms of where they're taking place and who's being disadvantaged?
Oh, of course. I mean, we can just look at this pandemic and realize that the people who are most affected by the digital divide were people who are on the same side as economic instability and vulnerability. Let me tell you what I mean by that. We saw at the onset of the pandemic, 50 million school-aged children be sent home. And out of that, we found that there were about 15 to 16 million of them who did not have either home broadband service or device. Later, we discovered that 9 million of them didn't have either. And the kids that did not have either were predominantly people of color. They were poor, they were rural, they were foreign born. And these are the same folks that sit on the wrong side of economic opportunity in society for a variety of structural reasons. When we think about older Americans who often sit on the wrong side of the divide, a lot of times that's due to the fact that their age sort of restricts them from taking full advantage of technology because we haven't thought about the type of disadvantages that older Americans are subjected to. They were part of the digital divide. When we think about rural residents who often sit in very isolated geographies that are unable to access the regular services that people like you and me may have, although I'm presuming that you're from the city. But when you think about people who were basically silenced, the farmers, all of those people comprise what I call in my new book, the digitally invisible. They're people that we know exist, but we never correlated their realities with the lack of having an access to broadband or to an internet-enabled device.
Right. And of course, this conversation is taking place in the middle of a pandemic, as you mentioned. How has the pandemic made the divide worse, and with what kinds of consequences?
Like I said, we're seeing young school-age children who are unable to connect to remote learning simply because they're not connected online. I just put out a piece which is entitled "No Child Deserves to be Left Offline," which I think is a way to level the playing field when it comes to digital equity. We're now talking about those same students that are going to be behind in both learning and have a series of mental health challenges. But some of that could have been avoided had we ensured that equitable access to technology was available in our nation's public schools. When we think about, this pandemic and the stress that was on hospitals, the fact that people had to start seeing their doctors via their smartphone devices or computers, in some respects, it was actually great. Because the health disparities that were witnessed during the pandemic, the susceptibility, for example, of the virus to people of color, 1 in every 4 African American was infected with COVID and had a higher likelihood of death. When we think about telehealth, that actually turned into an opportunity for people with health disparities, because we also know that disadvantaged populations often tend to carry smart devices. So they can open up their phones, right, and now talk to their doctors. All of these factors have actually contributed to, accelerated digitization, in addition to this movement from, an inline to an online economy. And it's made some of these scenarios worse. I mean, can you imagine if you were one of the people trying to apply for unemployment benefits early in the pandemic? If you didn't have access to the internet, you might as well forget it. You were not able to actually file for those benefits. And the same thing with the vaccination and the testing. So we've got to really realize as a country that we have an other America. We're a tale of two broadband cities, right? Where one is actually fully connected and the other is still struggling to get by. And that's something that should not be unusual to us because we've seen this before.
And we're speaking with Dr. Nicol Turner Lee, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies, the Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institute, also serves as Co-Editor-in-Chief of Tech Tank. And Dr. Turner Lee has the forthcoming book on the U.S. digital divide titled Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. So, Dr. Turner Lee, what kinds of consequences are there on quality of life from being digitally left out?
It's so interesting. As part of my book, I had the opportunity to go across the country prior to the pandemic and just talk to a range of people, local neighbors or residents of a community, a barbershop owner, people I just walked up to on the street and said, "Hi, I'm doing a study on internet access in America. What's your internet like?" And what you found was, for people who lived in some of the most rural areas of this country, they're quiet. It's the example I always give. In my book, I talk about this man who owned an auto mechanic shop, and they didn't have broadband for a very long time. So I was out there investigating this very, small mesh network that was actually developed in partnership with a local ISP. And basically what he said is like being in rural with broadband is like the ice cream truck pulling up in your neighborhood with just two flavors, and both of them you probably don't like, right? But for the most part, there's not a selection that you would get in other areas. And I think to a certain extent, it's right. In rural communities, we don't see the type of deployment that we would see in urban areas. But in urban areas, we don't have people who can afford it. There's not enough options for competition. And so people have to make choices around broadband or bread. And so I think the consequences of this going forward is we are now relying upon technology to live, to learn, to love, to even see our loved ones as we actually navigate through this, Delta variant. If we don't get this right, we just run the risk of, again, foreclosing on economic, social, civic opportunities for people who need it the most.
Sure. And in trying to close these digital gaps, there are many actors. First, is there any reason to think that private industry will play an active role?
Well, on the heels of the almost passage of the infrastructure bill, I think it's promising because that bill in many respects shows government as a partner in this. Historically, private companies have been responsible for building these networks. They've put in trillions of dollars of capital based on a deregulatory environment that we had, shifting from the rotary telephone, of which I was around when that was there. My number was NE62437, to what we see now with smartphones. And so the private sector has done the best that they can. And honestly, there are areas that they haven't done the best, right? Because there's not been a return on investment for them to go into areas where there might not be as dense of a population or the business model is not there to recoup their investments. With that being the case, the Biden administration is saying, hey, no more of that. We've got to figure out how to make broadband a critical asset in infrastructure, much like water and electricity systems. So I think going forward, we're going to see government step in where private industry won't. And we're going to see private industry and government work together. And I think we're going to see them work together on like three areas, right? One is deployment. How can we accelerate broadband access to rural communities that do not have access to fiber or to 5G or other technologies? The second way is how do we make it more affordable? And as part of the negotiated plan to date, we're seeing that affordability is one of the pillars when it comes to broadband infrastructure. And there's a proposal to provide a $30 benefit as opposed to what people have now as a result of the pandemic, which is like $50, so people can pay their broadband bills. This proposal is also suggesting that people will get $100 towards a device. And for those who are listening, you can get that now. You get $50 for service and $100 for a device through the emergency broadband benefit that was authorized as a result of the pandemic. But I share that because I think we're going to see a lot more partnerships between the private sector and government in trying to get this right. I'll say that one more time since we got my annoying, okay? I'm one of those people, I'm like, I should have turned it off and I know better. Okay. I share that because I think we're going to see government and the private sector work closely together to solve these problems.
As well, they should. And you have noted there's also a role for schools to play. Have you seen any promise here?
Schools are doing the best that they can. During the pandemic, I think I spoke to over 2,500 educators and administrators. I am a child of a school teacher, but I never thought I would talk to that many teachers within one period of time over the course of 14 months. And why was I talking to schools? Well, schools had to automatically transition to remote learning. Some schools were prepared, like charter schools and private schools. The nation's K through 12 public schools weren't as prepared as they should have been. And why is that? Because, they're still dealing with some of the inequities that actually come from servicing, large minority populations or being areas or around, state or city funding that does not provide the same resources to their schools as others. With that being the case, schools struggled. But I have to tell you, there were many that also became my heroes and sheroes. Because here were superintendents and educators that had no idea about how to solve the digital divide who were now trying to figure it out. There were people in schools that were placing Wi-Fi enabled school buses. I had suggested that in an early op-ed in, remote areas just so kids could tap into broadband. There were schools that were, there's a school in Virginia that was using these metal digital display equipment to actually put Wi-Fi hotspots on it along the highway. they were doing the best that they could, right? Because no one had said to them that it's important for you to ensure that no child is left offline. And I give credit to the larger school districts like New York City, Los Angeles County Unified District, Fairfax County, where I'm at, who had to make a moral decision that they could not continue school in the way that they were trying to because people weren't connected. And think about it, New York City public school closed, I think, around April. And, as unfortunate as it was the only decision they could make because kids could not get online to learn. And so one of the things that I'm actually struggling with, I'll be honest, as we think about the return to school in the next few days and weeks across the country, everyone's like, we got to get these kids back in the classroom. Meanwhile, we've got a masking versus unmasking debates. We've got a variant that is affecting our youngest of our country. And we have no contingency plan that is going to be sustainable when it comes to digital access. And that's why I just recently put out this piece, No Child Left Offline, sort of playing off the No Child Left Behind Act and the Every Student Succeeds Act needs to be the mantra. We need to figure out a way for Congress to come in and make sure that these schools aren't scrambling, trying to get handouts from private companies and philanthropy to ensure that every kid has a hotspot in their backpack, a tablet or a PC, and the tools that they need for the 21st century. Listen, I'm a parent. It was very hard. My 14-year-old sat in the other room while I was sitting here working, and it was not pleasant. It really was not pleasant. But one of the things that I realized in hindsight, she has actually learned more tools than I did, when I was her age. She now knows how to work independently, collaboratively, integrate multimedia, how to manage her time when she's online. And these are skills that are actually going to stay with kids into this 21st century economy. So I am in no way suggesting that the children that were online received the best educational experience. We know that that's not the case. But I think part of it was because it was like, in the spirit of the Olympics, we didn't come off really well when the gunshot, and we had to actually start the race. When the race started, we were still trying to figure out what to do. So we didn't get that pivot, that extra pivot like the gentleman from Norway did when he beat a guy who comes out of my hometown in Mount Vernon, New York, in the 400 sprint. So I just say, we've just got to keep thinking through how do we do this in a way that we run it in correlation with what's happening with schools today and not necessarily abandon it and say, okay, we didn't like the results, so we're not going to do this. Well, guess what? These schools are going to close, people, at some point because we've not figured out how to manage this virus. And so we have to make sure that we're not disservicing the kids by scrambling again to figure out how to get them the right hardware and software and other supports to stay connected to learning.
Sure. Now, last January, you wrote a piece titled, Why America Needs a Tech New Deal. You call for tech to have a prominent place in Biden's Build Back Better agenda. Is it your sense that this administration understands the importance of this issue compared to everything else he has to deal with?
Listen, I am so happy by this infrastructure bill because it has broadband in it. And I think they've kind of been listening to me because I recently did a panel with the Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh, who is actually starting to integrate in broadband jobs into the larger Department of Labor agenda. When I wrote that piece, I was sort of thinking about President Biden's first day in office, where he talked about how we need an economic recovery, one that is so aggressive like that after the Great Depression, but, has the same type of equitable stance that Truman had versus Roosevelt when it came to involving all members of our communities. And that really stuck with me because as I thought about technology, many people would attest that all we hear about are like the bad of the big tech companies, what they continue to do to take away our civil liberties and freedoms, which, in some cases, that's accurate, right? But there's the other piece of technology that's not just used for giving someone a laptop and then allowing them to go online to actually just partake in this ecosystem that we keep fighting against. There's this part of technology that should not just be around consumption, but production. And so I wrote that piece with the intent that the same way we're looking at New Deal era programs in terms of infrastructure, as we think about broadband as infrastructure, there's a few ways to think about it, right? One is, who is going to build these networks? So if deployment is key and critical to actually laying the nation's infrastructure and broadband the same way we're going to lay the concrete for roads, we need to have workers who can do that. And so I propose in the Tech New Deal that there is this deployment adoption segment. How do we deploy the networks where people need it the most? How do we get people to utilize them? But then there's this workforce component. How do we get funding so that we can credential people so that they can go out there and build 5G networks or become the cloud computing customer service folks on the back end? These are not jobs that require an engineering degree. These are jobs that people can actually go and get certified for or transfer existing skills into. What are the apprenticeships that we might have to develop to get people more engaged? So that, to me, is really important when we think about New Deal era programs, where President Roosevelt was very, keen on making sure people in the country built those roads, bridges, and dams. And then the third part of my Tech New Deal is, how do we integrate local equity and local assets into the mix? And what do I mean by that? I don't know about many of you, but when I go to my local, strip mall, there's a lot of stores that have basically closed as a result of the pandemic. That space can be repurposed for new entrepreneurs and innovators within our own communities. It can become WeWork stations and incubators. We can find ways to even, take our kids who've been learning in the fast food restaurant parking lots into these unused spaces so that they could actually, study with some sense of dignity. I think it's important for us to even think about, on the local asset side, what would have happened if we had a digital connector, civil service, where people could actually have gotten a tablet and gone around their community registering people for the vaccination or doing on-the-spot unemployment input on their tablets. That's what we need in local communities right now. And I think one of the things of this Tech New Deal that gets me excited is, as we get closer to this infrastructure plan, we have all of this opportunity to be on the right side of history. And the extent to which we'll do that with broadband is going to be questionable. I mean, we've had a digital divide for decades. It just didn't start with the pandemic, right? But it's one of those things now that where it's at compared to where it was 20 years ago, it's so much more advanced. And the fact that we're doing these podcasts online and we're working remotely and we're seeing our doctors remotely, we need to figure out how we make that part of the economic revitalization of our country so we can prepare people for the next generation of work opportunities as well.
Mm-hmm. And you also write about many important steps that need to be taken to close the digital divide. Can you tell us what are the most important right now?
First and foremost, I think that we found post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, that we broke the digital social compact with Americans when it came to digital access. We knew that this technology was going to change the way that we live, learn, and earn. We knew that this technology had the ability to be so much more expansive than the human brain when it came to efficiencies. But yet, we're now addressing the fact that these millions of people that were left offline because we didn't provide the universal service that they needed to be part of the communications infrastructure. And so I think the first thing we need to do is really go back and look at our universal service programs. Are we doing enough to connect people to the resources that they need the most? Previously, I talked about the emergency broadband benefit. Well, we have another program that actually provides a benefit to people when they want to get online. It was before the pandemic, and it's called the Lifeline program. Started in 1986 by President Reagan. It provides $9.25. Well, guess what? Pandemic relief funding through the emergency broadband benefit provided $50. 3 million people signed up in its inception in May. Go figure. And the other program has had a pretty much a 40% capture rate. That really demonstrates how important digital equity is, in particular, how we address affordability concerns as well as adoption concerns. So I think we need to, one, go back and revisit universal service. I think, two, it's very important for us to be balanced in our approach. If we build it, doesn't mean that everybody's coming. And so there are going to be reasons why people want to get online, and there are going to be reasons why people do not. I swear my mother does not get online because she's always thinking that somebody is watching her because those darn cookies follow her all over the internet. And we're going to have to recognize that there will be people like that. So it's not something that we can force. But what I'm suggesting is we could actually make it more functional so that people get online for the things that they need. So despite my mother not wanting to get on the internet for leisurely, entertainment, she does get on there to see her doctor. And she saw that doctor during the pandemic. So I think we need to make it worthwhile and find the right partners that can help us to diffuse the positive utilization of the internet so that we're not always talking about it as, the perils that are associated with it. I think, three, it's time for us as a country to really start thinking about this new ecosystem and what protections we also need to put in place, like privacy. And so I would also put into this discussion that online privacy matters. And the more that we allow, the internet to become the main course when it comes to communications infrastructure, and we don't set guidelines for consumer privacy, we're essentially opening it up to the scammers. I was just reading today about the child tax credit that is putting money back into the hands of households with children. Well, the scammers have gotten hold of it, and they're using our communications infrastructure to sort of redirect people's cash into something else. We got to stop that, and we've got to make sure that we can come up with the right rules of the road for online privacy and the right enforcement for the bad actors. I can't believe it. Just the other day, I had somebody tell me my Norton was expiring and was going to charge my card like $500. And, I'm a savvy internet user. I looked at the email and saw all the misspellings, and the lack of capitalization, and called my bank and said, listen, if this joker comes to try to take my money, they're a scam. But imagine how many people don't know how to do that. So I think it's important for us to engage in online privacy. And finally, I would say, engage as we go forward with more connectivity in media literacy so people can discern what's right and what's wrong. And the thing that, I would just say this is where it's not necessarily a whole part of the digital divide, but when you have people who are digitally disconnected, they tend to be more prone to misinformation, right? Because they're not on long enough to make certain decisions. But then more importantly, they tend to be excluded from the opportunities that the internet provides. And so I think it's really important for us to start thinking about Internet 2.7 and what we're going to do to make it much more equitable and fair.
Okay. Dr. Nicol Turner Lee, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies, Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institute, joining us today. And of course, keep an eye out for Dr. Turner Lee's forthcoming book, Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. Dr. Nicol Turner Lee, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
And we certainly appreciate all of your work. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with Washington Post reporters Carol Leonnig and Phil Rucker on their behind-the-scenes story of former President Trump's last year in office.
What was your overall impression of that last year?
Well, I'm really struck by your takeaway because it was ours as well. Phil and I often found ourselves moving against the reflex to have our jaws hit the floor during these interviews. We were sitting with people, realizing that while we had thought we had gotten a lot of this for the Washington Post in our reporting, we thought we had done a good job capturing what 2020 was like in real time or close to it. There was so much more, and we discovered that in this deeper excavation. Once the president was no longer the president, people freed up to talk, people who had been suffering in silence or enduring in silence, and they let loose. And what we discovered was the closest and most ardent supporters of the president were in a near panic about what bizarre thing the president would do next, or how they needed to throw their body in front of something that they thought would be dangerous for the democracy or imperil Americans' lives.
What was your takeaway, Phil?
I think that's right. We were surprised by how much worse and more chaotic and more dangerous everything was behind the scenes. We thought we knew the story in real time, in part because of the reporting we and many of our colleagues did in real time, but also because the horrors played out in public for the country to witness. And yet, when we did the deeper reporting, there was so much more happening that we just didn't know about.
So many sources that you talked to, and I want to get to some of those a little bit later, but your sources included a sit-down with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, which went on and on and on. Carol, what was that like? Describe that scene.
Oh my. I mean, there's so many elements of it that were fascinating and hard to believe. We arrived at the Mar-a-Lago, his club in Palm Beach, at 5:00, as suggested. We met him in the lobby where he wanted to conduct this interview. That was strange on its face. Why would you want to talk to reporters about the efficacy or the tone of your presidency in a room where anybody can walk through?
Public lobby, right? The public lobby.
Exactly. And it turned out that was part of the theater as arranged by the president, the former president, Donald Trump. He seemed to want for people who were arriving for dinner at the club and starting to stroll in to see that these Washington Post or Washington reporters were coming down to have their audience with Donald Trump, that he was still relevant and important, somebody to be seen and to interview, and vice versa. It seemed he wanted us to see that he has an enormous fan base there at his club. People sort of tiptoeing over sheepishly to say how much they were glad to be here, to kiss his ring. There was a Congressman, Dan Crenshaw, who came over to tell the president how hearty and hale he looked. What's your secret, sir? Laura Ingraham came by in clam bake pants to wave to him and explain that, he should tune in to her show the next day. She was really going to go hard against the doctors who had criticized President Trump's response to the coronavirus. And then finally, Kimberly Guilfoyle, Donald Trump Jr.'s girlfriend, sort of obsequiously tiptoed over to plead for her boyfriend's father to come visit her table and meet her friends, who she promised were huge supporters of Donald Trump. The place is a lot like Donald Trump's Brigadoon. It's an exile, but it's also a place where he has a certain reality that is not tempered and not disputed. It has no correlation to reality, but it's his reality and nobody questions it. And also, as we left the interview after 2 hours and 45 minutes, he came out striding out onto the patio where his dinner guests had finally all assembled. They gave him a standing ovation as he crossed the threshold, and the music playing in the background was Hail to the Chief.
Oh, no. Yeah. Well, Phil, why, I'm sure you ask yourselves this, why would he agree to talk to you? I mean, your book, A Very Stable Genius, good reporting, but it was really what did not show Donald Trump in the most positive light. Did he think he could persuade you to write a hagiography here?
I think he spoke to us for a couple of reasons. And you're right that A Very Stable Genius was not the most flattering book, but it was, of course, a true book, a deeply reported book about his presidency. He refused to do an interview with us for that book, and he trashed the book when it came out. But all it took was one ask to get the interview for this second book, and he agreed right away. I think for a few reasons. One, he's no longer president, and so he misses the back and forth, the give and take with reporters. He used to have those interactions every day, and now he's, nobody's coming down there to ask him questions every day. So he wanted the audience, he wanted the chance to talk, I think. But I think he also thought he could improve the narrative of our book on the margins, perhaps persuade us of his thinking in some areas, or at least have his perspective be represented in the narrative of our book. And he wanted to try to curate history and shape the way people will view his presidency and his legacy. We're not that gullible. We're pretty hard-nosed reporters. And when we got down there, we'd already interviewed 140 cabinet members and senior administration officials and advisors to Trump. And so we weren't looking for him to be our truthful narrator. He could never fill that role. But we did want to hear his perspective, and we're glad we did. And it became a pretty powerful and I think quite revealing epilogue to the book.
Carol, if there's one word that appears on every I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much, that one word that appears on every single page of the book, it is weak. the president, former president, had an obsession with appearing weak.
Yes.
How did you experience that? I mean, tell some examples of that, for example.
I find it interesting you are struck by that word too, because it drove so much of the way Donald Trump governed, if you can call it governing. I mean, really, he was focused on how he could avoid looking weak, how he could look strong. Partly that was because he believes his base is super excited about him being this pugilist figure, a defender of them, of their rights, their America, whatever that means. And the other part seems to be innately part of his personality, and it tracks with the way, a Michael Cohen or another ally of his would describe Donald Trump's motivations. Here's a couple of ways in which it drove him during 2020, this catastrophic year where we really needed a president who was thinking about the country and not himself. He was just beside himself on June 1 when that's a Monday morning, after Black Lives Matter protesters, people who've flocked to the White House that Friday night to protest the killing of George Floyd. He's furious because that Friday night he had been taken to the bunker. Is he angry that he's taken to a subterranean basement in the White House for his safety? No, he's angry because the information leaks that he was taken there. And he literally says to his defense secretary, to his attorney general, to his chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that the thing that makes him so angry is how it will make him look to other foreign leaders. They'll be laughing at me. I look weak. I can't even control the situation in my own city. And he also, in the moment that he contracts COVID, he's also beside himself on the notion that, hold on, I should rewind a moment and say that compulsion to look strong in that moment in June actually leads to one of the most authoritarian, just unbelievable moments where he pushes every single peaceful protester out of Lafayette Square outside the White House. Federal forces are ordered to use rubber bullets, chemical gas canisters, riot shields. And you've seen the video. We've all seen the videos of people who were praying and chanting being shoved chaotically out of this square. Not exactly how you treat people who have First Amendment rights. But the reason that happens is Donald Trump wants to look tough. Yeah. He wants to show everybody he's got Washington in hand. And it happens again and again and again.
And Phil, so much of you, at least the whole, I'd say, first three quarters of the book, your book deals so much with COVID, because that's what that's what we all, as an American people, were experiencing at the time, and it consumed so much of his presidency. Following on that, the week, not appearing weak, one indication of it was his refusal to wear a mask, or at first even to admit that he was vaccinated, correct?
That's right. He didn't admit that he had taken the vaccines until after leaving office, and he's actually not shown any documentary proof of that. He has long, throughout, predating his presidency, long been a skeptic and an opponent of vaccines generally and shots. But anyhow, he says he took the coronavirus vaccine, but he didn't do so on camera or in a way that would promote the efficacy and the safety of it to his followers in a public fashion. As for the masks, his advisors pleaded with him to wear a mask, and not just the health advisors and people like Dr. Fauci, who were, repeatedly trying to explain to him the science behind it, but also his political advisors. His pollster, Tony Fabrizio, prepared an internal polling review of the popularity of masks in the summer of 2020 and presented it to the president and showed him if he were to support masks, it would actually help him. in the campaign, that it would improve his favorability as it relates to managing the coronavirus, and Trump still refused to do so because he thought that a mask looked weak. That was sort of his gut instinct about image and branding. He thought it was a sign of weakness, and he didn't want to wear one. He, of course, did wear a mask on a couple of occasions, perhaps most famously when he was returning from Walter Reed after being hospitalized with the virus, and he wore the mask getting off the helicopter, and then when he climbed up to the balcony of the residence, he famously ripped the mask off his face, and that's actually the photograph that appears on the cover of our book. But generally, he was not an advocate of masks, and he did not wear it in a way that health experts thought could have persuaded the public to wear one.
Carol, there's so many questions about the COVID that pop up through the book, but in terms of, he also was not Donald Trump was not a big advocate of testing, right? Because as you keep pointing out, I mean, he kept saying, the more testing we do, the more cases are going to be, and the numbers look bad for me.
Yeah, this is a very confounding element of Donald Trump's presidency at a time when American lives hang in the balance and his decisions really are life and death decisions. He is focused on what he repeatedly told his cabinet members and his medical advisors. He's focused on what he calls his numbers.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking of it like American people dying, he's thinking about how many numbers are they rising, showing that this virus is not, as he initially pronounced it, a miracle. It's just going to go away miraculously. It's nothing. We've got it totally under control, which is what he said throughout January through March. No problems, no problems. There are two places where members of his administration are flabbergasted, gobsmacked by Donald Trump's reference to his numbers. One of them is when he is called from his chief of staff's office. The chief of staff at the time, Mick Mulvaney, is gathering a few coronavirus task force members to discuss a plan to basically fly emergency evacuation military planes out of Wuhan, carrying U.S. employees, diplomats, and also government workers to get them out of what essentially is a shuttered city, a city that's on lockdown that China is trying to barricade, and they want to get their own Americans out of there. And they want to alert the president they're doing this. Well, the president is beside himself when they first tell him, and he says, oh, no. We're not getting my numbers up. What if some of those people are sick? They shouldn't even have been in China. Why were they in China? Now, he's referring to U.S. employees who agreed to go there to represent our country. Not to speak of the Americans who happen to be there for other reasons. Another time that he sort of stuns his colleagues, his allies, his political advisors is when he is on the phone with Alex Azar, basically screaming at Azar, the Health and Human Services Secretary, at the top of his lungs, demanding to know who created this monster of having the government be responsible for testing. And Azar is confused, according to our reporting, about why is the president so upset that the CDC is engaged in doing some of the model test creations, creating the baseline for other tests in the future. And he's puzzling through, as the president is screaming, what exactly are you upset about? And it comes to a head with the president explaining, you're doing this testing. The government shouldn't be doing it. It's just driving up my numbers. Yeah. We should never have owned this problem. Again, it doesn't really help the American people that he's supposed to be representing for him to be worried about the statistics rather than the value of testing, which is, so obvious to us now, keeping down transmission by figuring out who's infected and keeping them away from people that are healthy.
Did you conclude, Phil, and Carol, but Phil, start with you, that had he taken the COVID problem more seriously and demonstrated more leadership, that Donald Trump would have actually won the election?
He certainly could have won the election. He would have been in much better standing had he, won the approval of the American people for his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And if you think about it, the pandemic was a huge political opportunity for him because we've seen through history that presidents, when they're faced with a major national crisis like this, if they do well managing it, their popularity goes up substantially. Look at George W. Bush in after 9/11 and won re-election in 2004, largely on the strength of his sort of waning but still potent popularity from 9/11. And you could also look at the state of New Jersey, where Governor Chris Christie's popularity soared, given his handling of Hurricane Sandy. And Christie actually, there's some moments in our book where he's giving Trump this same counsel, saying, just play it smart on COVID, listen to the doctors, let them take the lead on the response, do what they say, and people will approve of that. You'll be popular. But Trump didn't do that, of course, and the rest is history. I will say he wouldn't have necessarily been a lock for re-election, because even though before COVID he looked like he was on a glide path to winning a second term, the economy was so strong, the Democrats seemed like they were in a bit of a mess given how crowded and complicated their primary campaign was. We should keep in mind that Trump's approval rating with the general public was always below 50%. I mean, he never had that sort of broad mandate popularity with the general public and the electorate to make him a lock for re-election even before COVID, although he certainly would have had a much stronger chance.
Bill Press with Carol Leonnig and Phil Rucker. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Daley, Nicol Turner Lee, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.